Picture a routine law enforcement encounter, right? An officer approaches a suspect, grabs their arm, and the suspect just instantly drops to the ground in severe pain.
Right.
But there's no drawn weapon. There is no visible taser, no baton, no, physical struggle that would normally trigger an escalation of force protocol.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yep.
So if the weapon used in that exact moment is just entirely invisible to a bystander's smartphone camera, how do we ever hold authority accountable? Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a massive stack of sources to get through today, and our mission is to basically decode a central running theme buried inside all of them.
Which is hidden hazards, right?
Exactly. Hidden hazards and the boundaries of authority. We're looking at what happens when the mechanisms of power from, physical force on the street to government ledgers to literal athletic equipment that we wear, when all of that operates completely out of sight.
Right, and I do just want to jump in here quickly because the source material we're examining today touches on some really highly polarized figures.
Oh, definitely.
We're talking about everyone from ICE agents to the White House to political candidates on both sides of the aisle. So, for you listening, we have to look at this strictly through the lens of mechanics.
Yeah.
We aren't here to take a political side on any of these policies or, endorse any of these figures. Our job is literally just to decode the facts and the underlying systems exactly as they are reported so you can understand how these structures actually operate behind closed doors.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are starting right on the front lines of law enforcement technology. So, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is preparing a no-bid contract worth up to $20 million to buy thousands of what are essentially electric shock gloves.
Right, electric shock gloves.
Yeah, they're manufactured by this Kentucky-based company called Compliant Technologies, and the device is known as the GLOVE. It stands for Generated Low Output Voltage Emitter.
Okay, so the mechanics of the device rely entirely on subtlety. Officers activate an electrical mode with a hidden switch, and then the gloves deliver a painful shock to gain compliance.
And it's just on contact.
Exactly. They only function through direct skin contact. Now, the argument for their deployment, which is championed by supporters like John Peters from the Institute for the Prevention of In-Custody Deaths, is that the shock basically feels like an intense bee sting.
A bee sting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The stated goal here is rapid de-escalation. The pain stimulus is meant to force compliance within seconds, which hypothetically ends physical confrontations much faster than, wrestling a detainee to the ground.
Right.
Though the manufacturer does include warnings that the gloves shouldn't be used as punishment or on vulnerable populations like children, pregnant women, the elderly, or those with disabilities.
I mean, it is essentially a sci-fi localized invisible taser. You wear it on your hands, flip a switch, and touch someone. But this is exactly where the accountability loop seems to just completely break down.
It really does.
Because the ACLU and other civil liberties groups are sounding a massive alarm over this. General Nick Borchetta argues this is functionally a concealed weapon. ICE already faces immense scrutiny over its use of force,
Oh, absolutely.
So if an agent can deploy an electric shock with the slight push of a button that observers, or even the body cameras themselves, might not be able to see, how on earth can an agency maintain any functional oversight?
Right, because there's no visual cue.
Exactly. If I see an officer draw a baton, there is a visual record. There's a very clear escalation of force. If an officer just grabs someone's arm with a glove, how does a judge or internal affairs know if a shock was deployed to prevent violence or if it was just used to be quietly punitive?
Well, and that is the paradox of modern, less lethal law enforcement technology.
Yeah.
As the tools shrink in size and lethality, transparency shrinks right along with them.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
We constantly push for options that reduce catastrophic injuries, which, that is a vital goal.
Mm-hmm.
But when deployment becomes invisible to a bystander's camera, or even the officer's own body cam, the burden of proof shifts entirely.
It's just their word against the detainees.
Exactly. It becomes the word of the officer versus the word of the detainee. And oversight fundamentally relies on evidence. If a use of force event leaves no obvious physical trace and has zero visual signature, the line between a necessary de-escalation tool and a hidden instrument of abuse becomes nearly impossible to audit.
Right.
So this debate isn't just about a $20 million contract for gloves. It's a fundamental question of whether accountability can actually survive miniaturization.
Man, that invisible boundary of authority on the ground is terrifyingly opaque. But that exact same tension authority acting completely outside of visible, traditional boundaries is actually scaling all the way up to the executive branch.
Yeah, we're seeing it at the very top.
Because the financial opacity at the highest levels of government is just as invisible as those shot gloves. The Trump administration has assembled nearly $900 million for sweeping White House modernization projects.
Which is a staggering amount of money.
It's huge. We're talking about a massive new East Wing ballroom, a helipad, a visitor screening center, and significant upgrades to Lafayette Square. But the real story isn't the construction itself, it's the funding mechanism.
Right, where the money is coming from.
Exactly. According to the documents, roughly $875 million has been routed through a typically very modest account called the White House Repair and Restoration Account. That pool includes $500 million transferred internally from the Secret Service and the White House Military Office, plus over $300 million in private donations.
And that specific combination has triggered a massive constitutional showdown.
I can imagine.
Yeah, a federal appeals court recently intervened, ruling that the administration actually cannot unilaterally pool these funds. They stated that Congress has exclusive authority over the construction and demolition of White House structures.
So it's headed to the courts.
The administration is actively appealing this, and the case appears headed straight for the Supreme Court. The core issue here is the circumvention of the congressional power of the purse.
Wait, hold on. Let me just play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
If the administration is raising $300 million in private donations, and the White House even noted the ballroom itself will be privately financed, and they are just shuffling existing executive funds from the Secret Service for the rest, why does Congress even care? Shouldn't a president be able to renovate their own residence if taxpayers aren't footing the whole bill?
Well, pooling transferred internal funds with private donations functionally erases the legislative boundary on spending.
How so?
The Constitution gives the legislative branch the exclusive power to appropriate funds precisely so the executive branch cannot build out its own infrastructure, whether that's a standing army or a sprawling executive palace, without the explicit voted consent of the public's representatives.
Ah, okay.
So when the executive branch quietly transfers $500 million away from the Secret Service and just drops it into a construction account, they are bypassing the appropriations committees entirely.
And I guess the $300 million in private money makes that leverage dynamic even worse.
It fundamentally alters the relationship between the public and the seat of government. I mean, if a sitting president can accept hundreds of millions in private, undisclosed donations to build physical federal structures on White House grounds, it opens a massive loophole for influence.
Because you have to wonder what they're getting in return.
Exactly. Who is donating that capital, and what kind of access or leverage do they expect? This goes far beyond simple home improvement, you know. It is a stress test of the separation of powers.
Right.
The invisible hazard here is that if the executive branch can successfully bypass financial oversight by simply creating a hybrid pool of private cash and redirected security funds, the congressional check on executive power is effectively neutralized.
Wow. And that financial opacity at the White House, that's happening at a massive macro level. But when you look slightly further down the federal ladder into individual agencies, the invisibility isn't just about the money, it's about the people spending it.
Yeah, the lines get very blurry.
The line between public servant and private contractor just completely vanishes. The Wired report in our sources highlights a glaring example of this at FEMA. There's a woman named Cara Voorhees who has been operating as what they describe as a shadow administrator.
Shadow administrator, that sounds intense.
Right. And according to court filings and deposition testimony, Voorhees was working inside FEMA as a special government employee. But concurrently, at the exact same time, she was being paid $325 an hour as a subcontractor through a private company called Anchor Code Technologies.
Wow.
And the web gets even thicker because Anchor Code is owned by a man named Kyle Schutt, an operative for the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, who is also working in government while his company was involved in Homeland Security contracting.
Now, it is crucial to note for you listening that these are allegations in active litigation, and no court has found anyone liable for ethics violations at this stage.
Right. Important disclaimer.
However, ethics experts are raising massive red flags regarding post-government employment restrictions and profound conflicts of interest here. The mechanism allowing this to happen, this special government employee designation, it was originally designed as a highly restricted bridge.
What was it supposed to be used for?
It was meant to allow the government to bring in outside scientists, industry leaders, or really niche experts for very short, temporary advisory periods without forcing them to liquidate their entire private sector careers.
But instead of a temporary bridge, it's functioning as a master key to both government strategy and private profit. I mean, it's like a building inspector also owning the construction company they're supposed to be auditing.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
If the facts hold up, how can a structure like this even exist without triggering an immediate conflict of interest? You have an individual advising a federal agency on its operations while simultaneously pulling a massive hourly rate from a subcontractor that is financially tied to that same government apparatus.
Well, government contracting relies on incredibly dense, opaque layers of bureaucracy. The problem arises when the people providing the strategic direction for an agency are intimately, financially entangled with the private entities executing the work.
Right, it's a revolving door.
Exactly. The formal boundaries of who works for the taxpayer and who works for a private profit margin just dissolve. This creates an environment where even if every piece of paperwork is technically filed and theoretically legal under that SGE loophole, accountability is impossible to track.
Because you don't know who they're really working for.
The public trust is severely eroded because the lines of allegiance, whether the individual is acting in the interest of disaster relief or the interest of anchor code technologies, are entirely hidden from view.
It's crazy. And, when you have invisible police tools on the street, opaque funding structures at the White House, and revolving door bureaucrats at federal agencies, you breed a deep baseline level of institutional distrust.
Oh, absolutely.
And we are seeing that exact distrust weaponized as a primary mechanism in our electoral system. Let's look at the Republican gubernatorial primary in Minnesota.
Okay, yeah.
Mike Lindell, the founder of MyPillow, who was explicitly endorsed by Donald Trump for his efforts on election integrity, lost the GOP primary to Minnesota House Speaker Lisa DeMuth. But the real story is the margin and his reaction to it.
Right.
Lindell lost by roughly 45,000 votes. That is an 11 percentage point blowout. Yet he is outright refusing to concede. On a live stream on Lindell TV, he dismissed the calls to concede by asking, "Why would I listen to the AP?" and just insisted there were still hidden votes to be counted. Meanwhile, DeMuth is simply moving on, pivoting to the general election against Democratic nominee Amy Klobuchar.
The refusal to concede has really transitioned from a fringe reaction into a standardized political tactic.
Yeah.
I mean, Lindell has a long history of challenging election outcomes, most notably the 2020 presidential election.
Right, of course.
The strategy relies on taking the visible evidence of the vote, the actual ballots counted by local officials, and trying to convince the electorate that the real result is somehow hidden by a corrupt system.
But the math here is what I just can't get past. Losing a local primary by a few hundred votes or even 1,000, sure, demand a recount, check the provisional ballots, audit the machines.
Absolutely.
But 45,000 votes in a state primary is an insurmountable chasm. There aren't 45,000 hidden ballots just sitting in a box somewhere. At what point does basic, undeniable arithmetic override a political narrative?
For political figures whose entire brand identity is built on the premise that the system is inherently rigged, basic arithmetic is irrelevant.
Irrelevant, wow.
Yeah, because accepting a clear mathematical defeat shatters the foundational premise of their movement. Conceding is viewed not just as losing a race, but as validating the very system they claim is corrupt.
Oh, I see.
But this has severe downstream effects on the democratic process. Democracy fundamentally relies on a mutual agreement between citizens and candidates to accept the visible boundary of the ballot box.
Right, the agreed-upon rules.
Exactly. When candidates systematically deny those boundaries despite overwhelming mathematical evidence, it conditions their supporters to view every single democratic outcome as a conspiracy. It degrades local election infrastructure because county clerks and poll workers are constantly bombarded by accusations of hiding votes that simply do not exist.
It turns the entire concept of a verified election into just another hidden hazard. The public is told they basically can't trust what they see.
Exact.
But, while political figures are fighting over institutional boundaries and election math, there's a much more tangible, immediate pressure squeezing everyday people. Let's pivot to the July inflation data, because the way this data is reported versus how it is felt is another massive disconnect.
Well, for sure. The disconnect is huge.
So consumer prices rose 0.1% in July. Headline inflation on an annual basis came in at 3.4%, with core inflation at 2.5%. The financial world is basically breathing a sigh of relief. Morgan Stanley's Ellen Zentner noted that this data keeps the narrative intact that the Federal Reserve will likely hold off on hiking interest rates at their September meeting. So the markets are cheering.
Right, but the nuance in the data reveals where the actual pressure points are. Energy prices actually fell 1.5%, which helped drag that overall average down.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, shelter and food rose 0.1%,
Wow.
and housing continues to be the massive outlier here, making up roughly two-thirds of the overall monthly increase in consumer prices.
I want to use an analogy here to clarify what economists mean when they celebrate inflation cooling, because it is incredibly misleading for the average person.
Let's hear it.
It's like a car going 80 miles an hour down the highway, and the driver takes their foot slightly off the gas, slowing down to 75. You are not stopping. You are definitely not putting the car in reverse. You are just accelerating slightly less aggressively than you were a minute ago.
That's a great way to look at it.
So if the financial markets are throwing a parade and the Fed is relaxing its grip on interest rates, why doesn't this 0.1% report feel like a victory when you're actually scanning your items at the checkout counter?
Because the problem with the slowing car is that you are still moving further and further away from where you started.
Right.
That is the vital difference between disinflation and deflation. What the macroeconomic data shows right now is disinflation. The rate at which prices are increasing is slowing down, but the prices are still going up.
They're still going up.
Right. They are compounding on top of the massive historic price hikes consumers already absorbed over the last 4 years. Deflation would mean prices are actually dropping, putting the car in reverse. But the Federal Reserve aggressively avoids deflation, as it can trigger severe economic recessions because consumers stop spending capital, waiting for goods to get cheaper.
So the base price is already locked in at a historic high. If a carton of eggs went from $2 to $4 over the last few years, a 0.1% increase is acting on that new $4 base.
Precisely. The pain is cumulative. For the family budgeting for groceries and rent, and remember that housing metric is driving two-thirds of this increased disinflation, offers absolutely zero immediate relief.
Yeah, they don't feel it at all.
The editor of the newsletter framed it perfectly. Progress is being measured in inches, not miles. The hidden hazard in this economic data is the compounding effect. A 0.1% monthly increase sounds tiny, almost statistically invisible. But when that tiny percentage is applied to a cost of living that is already 30 to 40% higher than it was just a few years ago, the consumer is still being actively squeezed.
Oh.
The macroeconomy might be stabilizing on a spreadsheet, but the microeconomy of the household budget is still bleeding.
Man, we have spent this entire deep dive analyzing abstract hidden hazards, concealed shock gloves blurring the lines of police force, buried ethics conflicts in federal agencies, opaque billion-dollar funding streams, and invisible economic pressures compounding at the grocery store.
It's a lot of invisible threats.
It is. But for a high school student in Arkansas, the hidden hazard wasn't abstract at all. It was incredibly literal, and it was sitting right on top of his head.
Oh my goodness, this is easily the most surreal story in the source material.
It really is.
So at Mamel High School in Arkansas, a football player was running drills during practice. He practiced for nearly an hour in the heat before he felt something physically moving inside his helmet.
Oh, man.
Yeah. He alerted a coach. They carefully removed the helmet, inspected the padding, and discovered a live, roughly 2-foot venomous cottonmouth snake, a water moccasin, just tucked inside the interior of the helmet.
I cannot even fathom the logistics of this. How do you run full-speed football drills, sweating, hitting, and moving around for an hour and not notice a 2-foot venomous reptile sharing the exact same piece of equipment as your skull?
It defies all logic. It really does, and the extraction process was just as absurd. The police were called to the field, and they initially misidentified it as a copperhead.
Okay.
So believing they could flesh it out, they submerged the entire helmet in a tub of water. But cottonmouths are semi-aquatic.
Oh, no. So it didn't care.
Exactly. The snake was entirely unbothered by being underwater. It was practically in its natural habitat. It eventually surfaced just enough for an officer to use a specialized grabber tool to safely extract it. Animal Control then relocated it to a wooded area. Chris Davis, the Animal Services Director, stated he had removed snakes from car vents, engine blocks, and purses, but never a football helmet, calling the entire situation unreal.
And the most incredible detail about all of this, the player didn't even get bitten. After they pulled a deadly viper out of his gear, he just grabbed a replacement helmet and went right back to practice. He just kept running the drills.
It is hilarious, but it honestly serves as the ultimate reality check for our discussion today.
It really does. So let's wrap this up. Today we journeyed from the intense debate over IC's $20 million invisible shock gloves and a massive constitutional showdown over White House renovation funding, right through the murky ethics of FEMA subcontractors and the corrosive strategy of election denial in Minnesota.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We broke down why cooling inflation still actively burns at the checkout counter, and we ended with a literal venomous snake hiding in a football helmet. Our goal today was simply to unpack these complex sources impartially, to help you see the hidden mechanisms operating just beneath the surface of the news.
And as we close, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder on your own. We have seen today how remarkably well human beings adapt to hazards. Whether it's an economy that constantly squeezes our wallets, normalized ethical gray areas in our political institutions, or even a high school kid shrugging off playing football with a venomous snake on his head.
Yeah.
We just adapt, grab a new helmet, and keep running the drill.
Yeah.
It forces us to ask a difficult question. If we are this incredibly good at adapting to hidden hazards, at what point do we become entirely numb to the warning signs that the system itself is actually broken?
That is a question that will definitely stick with me. Remember, navigating the world requires a lot more than just opening your eyes. You have to know exactly what mechanisms you're looking for. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.